when a homeless girl stood on his marble doorstep. She didn't ask for food, money, or pity. She asked for 3 quiet hours, and her request shattered the way he saw his city. The knock is small and careful, like a child trying not to wake the street, and still it carries through the quiet hall. Luca Sterling leaves his laptop and the tidy stack of contracts. He crosses the marble floor in bare feet. He opens the door himself, because the staff are off tonight. Cold air slips into the foyer and lifts the corner of the hallway rug. The sky is clear, and the city sounds thin. The hour is so late that even the bars are quiet. On the stoop stands a girl in an oversized hoodie, a faded backpack at her feet. Her eyes steady in the cold, as if they have learned to measure risk before hope. He says hello, and asks if she is lost. She shakes her head. She asks if this is where the owner lives. Her voice is steady and small. He says yes, he is the owner. He waits for a request for money or food. He waits for a story he has heard before. He waits for himself to guide her toward a shelter. None of that happens. She says she needs a quiet place for 3 hours. A place with light and a chair. No police, no shouting, just a corner where her brother can sleep. There is no brother in sight, only the idea of one. And still Luca looks past her, as if a small boy might appear from the shadows. He sees only the clean sidewalk and the tall iron gate. He asks her name. She says Maya. She asks if he is Mr. Sterling. He nods. He says, "Call me Luca." The word feels different in the doorway, as if names are warmer when spoken inside. The porch light draws a thin line across the floor. The girl does not cross it without being asked. He says that it is late, that he cannot, that there are rules, that there is liability, that the security company will be angry. His words line up like a policy page, tidy and safe. Maya listens without blinking, then points across the street at the glass tower with his logo. She names the service entrance, the loading bay, the lobby lights that stay on all night. She says, the guard walks a circle every 20 minutes. She has watched him. She knows where the cameras end. She says your lobby is warm, your chairs are clean, your coffee machine hums all night. No one uses it after 10 except the guard. He always takes the second paper cup. Something shifts inside Luca. A small click he cannot ignore. Numbers move through his mind. Square feet, power bills, empty chairs, the cost of light, the cost of looking away. He opens the gate wider. He tells her to wait 1 minute. He steps into his office and texts the head of facilities. His message is simple. Open the lobby across the street. Hot water on, no removals for sleeping. He adds, please. The girl does not reach for his hand or step closer. She only stands in the doorway and repeats her words with calm certainty. She is not here for money. She is not here for food. She is here to ask for a place that is safe and quiet for 3 hours so her little brother can sleep. She lists the conditions as if she has practiced them. Any lobby, any conference room, any corner without cameras or shouting, just a roof and light, no questions and no police. Luca Sterling listens, the words sounding unlike anything he expected. Because most requests he receives come wrapped in flattery or anger or desperation. But this one is stripped bare of all that. It is exact, simple, and steady. He studies her face. The way her eyes do not dart around. The way her voice does not tremble. She looks like a soldier in miniature, holding her ground because retreat would cost too much. He asks where her brother is. She tells him the boy is nearby, sleeping on a bench under the overhang of a closed cafe. Too small to stay awake, too tired to keep moving. She says she does not want charity. She does not want anyone to touch him. She only wants a roof that will not fall and a chair that will not be taken away. Luca feels the cold air pushing through the open door. He imagines a small body curled on wood, the hard surface pressing into bone, and something uneasy stirs inside him. He tells her he could call a shelter. She shakes her head quickly. No police, no intake forms, no clipboards, no promises that vanish by morning. He tries to explain that shelters are safe, She looks at him with a quiet knowledge that says she has been to those places, that she has seen things he has never had to see. And she says again, she only needs 3 hours. Luca is a man of plans and projections. He builds cities in numbers and maps. He has trained himself to measure everything by cost and benefit. But here is a child who measures time not in hours of productivity, but in hours of safety. He asks why 3 hours. She says because her brother sleeps deepest. Then, if he gets 3 full hours, his chest does not rattle so badly in the morning. If he gets less, he coughs until he cannot stand. She says she counts his breaths at night. She holds his hand until he is steady, and then she stays awake because someone must. Her voice does not break as she says it. Her tone is practical, the way one might describe fixing a leaking pipe or patching a hole. Something inside Luca gives way, a seam in the armor of his careful life. He tells her to wait. He crosses to his phone. He texts his facilities director again, and he adds another line, leave the lobby doors unlocked until dawn. No removals, no questions, no reports. He returns to the door and finds her still standing there, still steady, her backpack at her feet, her eyes fixed on him as if waiting for a verdict. He says, bring your brother. The lights are on across the street. The chairs are yours for as long as you need. For the first time, she lets out a long breath. Not relief exactly, but the release of someone who has carried a weight alone for too long, and now knows, at least for this night, she does not have to. Luca began to speak the way he always did. When someone asked for something that did not fit inside the lines of his carefully drawn plans. He explained about liability, about rules that bound him as much as anyone else, about the way insurance companies wrote restrictions that could not be ignored. His voice was steady and polite, the same tone he used with investors who asked for too much or contractors who pushed beyond scope, a tone that had ended more conversations than it had opened. He told himself he was being kind, even as he closed the door a little with every sentence. He said he could not allow strangers to sleep inside his buildings. He said the city would shut him down. He said lawyers would swarm. He said people would take advantage until there was no end. He thought he was protecting her from disappointment by speaking quickly, but the words built a wall between them, and he did not see how her shoulders stayed square and her eyes stayed clear. Maya Reyes did not interrupt until he paused for breath. Then she began to speak, not with anger, not with pleading, but with facts. She told him the building across the street was 12 stories, that the lobby was 4,200 square feet, that the heat stayed on all night because she had measured the vents with her hands in winter, that the water fountain ran 24 hours because she had tested it each night after the guard left his round. She said the patrol walked every 20 minutes, turning left first, then right, always checking the same 2 doors, and never the third. She said the cameras above the loading dock were broken because they never blinked. She said she had memorized the rhythm because her brother's sleep depended on knowing when it was safe to rest. Luca stopped speaking, the wall of policy collapsing in silence. He realized she knew more about his property than he did, more than the managers he paid to oversee it, more than the reports that reached his desk. He had walked those lobbies in daylight with architects and designers, discussing art pieces and marble tiles. But he had never walked them at night, never measured the silence, never timed the patrols. He had forgotten to look at what his buildings became when the world was not watching. And this girl, small and calm in her oversized hoodie, had seen everything. For the first time he noticed her shoes, scuffed and thin, the soles worn nearly through. He noticed the way her hands rested on the straps of her backpack, steady and unshaking, the way her posture spoke of discipline learned too early. He realized she was not guessing. She was reporting. And she was reporting with the accuracy of someone whose survival depended on every detail. He saw that she had been invisible to him until this moment, the way most people in his world remained invisible unless they carried contracts or checks. Now her presence filled the doorway, undeniable. He felt heat rise in his face, not from shame exactly, but from the sudden recognition that his efficiency and distance had cost him the truth of his own city. He had built towers of glass and steel, but he had not built trust, and in front of him stood a child who had. The night was clear and sharp, the streets almost empty except for the hum of traffic a few blocks away. Luca followed Maya across the wide avenue, his tailored coat pulled close against the cold, his polished shoes clicking on the pavement. She moved ahead of him without hesitation, her steps quick but certain, as if every line of sidewalk and every shadow had already been measured and tested. He realized with a strange jolt that this block, which he had thought of only in terms of square footage and rental yields, was a living map in her mind, each detail memorized not for profit but for survival. She pointed to the first loading bay, explaining how the vents above it blew warm air from the kitchen exhaust, making it a place where people gathered in the harshest weeks of winter. He had never noticed, not once, though his company owned the building. He had approved invoices for heating and repairs. He had debated costs with engineers, but he had never set foot here at midnight to feel the warmth or to see the small clusters of people who relied on it. Maya spoke of them without judgment, only description, a quiet catalog of where safety could be found and where it could not. Next, she led him toward the glass foyer of another tower, the one his designers had been so proud of, with its tall ceilings and sculpted light. In the day it looked like success, gleaming and impressive, but at night, she said, the guards grew restless and suspicious. The cameras there were active, and those who tried to rest on the steps were mocked, sometimes shoved along with words sharper than the wind. Luca had walked through that lobby dozens of times with partners and clients, admiring the gleam of the marble floor, never once thinking of the way the same space became hostile when the hour grew late. They passed an alcove between buildings where the wind rarely touched, a narrow cut of stone where people sometimes left blankets or small boxes hidden away. Maya touched the wall as she passed, pointing out how the concrete stayed dry even after rain, how it muffled sound from the street. He began to see the way she read his city, not as a developer, not as an investor, but as someone who had to understand it in order to survive it. Numbers turned into places, and those places turned into faces he had ignored, people who lived in the shadows of his towers while he discussed profits in glass conference rooms above. By the time they circled back toward his townhouse, he felt unsettled in a way he could not explain. She had given him a tour of a city he thought he owned, yet he realized he had never known it at all. Every doorway and vent she named, every corner she mapped with calm precision, revealed not only her resilience, but also his blindness. He had built buildings without ever learning how they were used after the lights dimmed. He had claimed to know the city while overlooking its most fragile truths. And beside him walked a girl with worn shoes and a steady gaze, who had shown him more in an hour than his reports had in years. The kitchen was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of the heating system hidden in the walls. Luca stood by the counter with his phone in his hand, the glow of the screen lighting his face. He typed the message quickly, his thumbs moving with the certainty of someone used to giving instructions that would be followed without question. Open 111, Harbor Lobby from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. Hot water on. Security briefed. The words looked strange on the screen, as if they belonged to someone else. But he pressed send before he could talk himself out of it. He looked up and saw Maya sitting at the edge of the table, her backpack still strapped to her shoulders, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her eyes fixed on the steam curling from 2 untouched cups of tea Josephine had placed there earlier. She did not reach for them, not even when the scent filled the room. She only watched, waiting for permission that had never been spoken. Something about the stillness of her posture, the discipline of not taking what was not offered, pressed against Luca's chest in a way he could not name. He turned back to his phone and wrote a second line, slower this time, his finger hesitating before he pressed send. No ID checks, No removals for sleeping. The words were blunt, without polish, but they felt heavier than anything he had written all day. He set the phone down and exhaled, realizing that with 2 short texts he had undone years of carefully enforced rules that had kept his company distant from the people who brushed against its walls. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. He told her the lobby across the street would be open, that no one would ask for her name or her papers, that no one would tell her to leave if she closed her eyes. Her gaze flickered then, the first real crack in her careful composure, and for a brief second he thought she might smile, but instead she lowered her eyes to the cups again. He slid one across the table, close enough for her to reach, and only then did she curl her hands around it, lifting it to her lips with the slow caution of someone who had been offered many things in life that were later taken back. The warmth seemed to ease something in her, though she kept her back straight and her eyes guarded. Luca realized he was watching the shape of trust being tested, fragile and uncertain, like glass still cooling after fire. He thought about the reports waiting on his desk, the contracts stacked in neat piles, the board members who would demand explanations for any change in routine. None of that mattered in this kitchen, not in the face of a girl who had memorized patrol schedules because her brother's sleep depended on it. For the first time in years, Luca felt that a decision he had made was not about growth or profit or projections, but about something that could not be measured. It was about choosing to see what he had ignored, and about opening a door that had been locked for far too long. Maya sat very still at the edge of the chair, the teacup empty beside her hand, the straps of her backpack still tight across her shoulders as if she could not let go of the weight she carried. Luca watched her with the quiet of a man who had run out of things to say, and then she reached into the worn fabric and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. It looked like something torn from a school notebook, the edges soft from being opened and closed too many times. She laid it carefully on the table, smoothing the creases with small hands that moved with the precision of habit. When she opened it fully, he saw lines drawn in black ink, straight but uneven, crossing and bending into shapes that formed a rough grid of the waterfront district. Buildings were marked as blocks, alleys as thin strokes, stairwells and side doors scribbled in between. It was not neat, but it was exact, the kind of map made by someone who had walked every line, who had counted every corner by footsteps and shadows. Across the paper were red X's, blue circles, and green stars, each one pressed hard enough into the paper to leave dents. She explained without hesitation, her voice flat but clear. Red X's were danger, places where guards shouted, or men followed, or doors slammed too fast. Blue circles were friendly doors, people who sometimes let her and her brother sit for a while, sometimes with food, sometimes just with silence. Green stars were the places that used to be safe, but were no longer. Doors locked, windows boarded, guards replaced. Luca bent closer, seeing his own buildings among the lines, but also dozens of others, places he had passed in his car without noticing, doors he had never opened. Maya pointed to each mark, as if reading from a record, telling him how many nights each place had worked, how long before someone pushed them away. She spoke of the stars with the most weight, her finger pressing gently on the faded green, saying, "This one used to be a church basement until they changed the locks. This one was a cafe, until a new owner posted signs. This one was a small lobby, where the guard used to turn a blind eye until he retired." She said the stars were important because they showed where kindness had been possible once, and if it had been possible once, it could be fixed again. Then she looked at him directly, the map spread between them like proof of a world he had not seen, and asked him to keep it safe. She said if something happened to her, the map mattered more than her bag or her clothes, because it carried the only record of places that still held warmth or could be made warm again. She asked him to fix the stars, to make them bright again, because people like her brother needed them, and people like her could not do it alone. Luca touched the paper lightly, feeling the dents left by her markers. the ridges of every X and circle and star, and he understood that this was not a drawing. It was a life's work. He folded it as carefully as she had unfolded it, and he promised her that it would not be lost. For the first time, he knew he was holding something more valuable than any plan stored in his office, because this was a blueprint not of buildings, but of survival. By the time the sun was high enough to throw pale light through the tall windows of his office, Luca's inbox had turned into a wall of alarms. The first message came from insurance, sharp and clipped, reminding him of clauses in his policies that clearly excluded responsibility for anyone who was not an employee or paying tenant. The next was legal, warning that opening a lobby without registration or oversight could create liability if anything happened on the property. After that came a letter from city permits, dry but stern, pointing to occupancy codes and fire regulations, and noting that any overnight activity without notice to the city might bring fines. Then came the board members, 5 separate messages before 8:30, each one more heated than the last, filled with phrases like shareholder trust, reputational risk, and corporate overreach. The longest message of all came from his CFO, Conrad Pike, a man who had been with him since the early days, who had learned to wrap caution inside layers of polite business language. Conrad called it a matter of unintended consequences. The phrase repeated 4 times in different ways. He described the risk of setting precedent, of being taken advantage of by opportunists, of letting compassion cloud judgment. He worried about the brand, about the press, about the effect on quarterly projections. The message was long enough to scroll 3 times on Luca's screen, careful and detailed, and it ended with a quiet request for a meeting before any further action was taken. Luca read them all in silence, his hands folded on the desk, his eyes moving without pause. Normally he would consider each point, weigh the risks, draft a reply with precise reasoning, but today he felt none of the usual pull toward compromise. He thought, instead of the girl sitting in his kitchen last night, of the folded map on the table, of the way she asked for nothing but safety and silence for 3 hours. He thought of her brother sleeping across the street on a cot in a lobby that would have stood empty, and he thought of how simple the change had been, how little it had cost, and how much it had mattered. When he finished reading the last line, he did not type long replies or schedule meetings. He selected them all, every warning, every objection, every demand, and forwarded the lot to compliance. His note was short, only 3 words: find a way. He pressed send and leaned back in his chair, the sound of the click small but final. For the first time, he did not feel bound by the language of risk, because he had seen a different kind of risk, the kind that came from looking away. The calls began soon after. Conrad first, then the board chair, then an outside lawyer. Luca answered none of them. He sat instead with the map folded in his pocket, knowing that in the hours ahead the noise would grow louder. But the truth was simple. The rules had been written for buildings, not for people, and it was time they changed. The house was still quiet when Josephine entered the kitchen, her steps steady on the polished floor, the morning light spilling in behind her. She had been part of the Sterling family for so many years that her presence felt like part of the walls themselves, quiet and constant, never demanding notice, yet always essential. She had seen 3 generations pass through these rooms. She had watched children grow into adults and then falter under the weight of their choices. She had kept the house steady even when the people in it were not. She carried a tray now, simple but careful, with toast, eggs, and a glass of orange juice. She set it on the table without fuss, her movements smooth, and only then did she look toward Maya, who sat small and stiff on the edge of the chair, her backpack still close at hand, as if she might need to leave at any moment. Josephine did not ask questions at first. She did not scold or probe. She simply placed a plate in front of the girl and pushed it gently closer. Maya's eyes flicked to Luca as if waiting for permission, but it was Josephine who spoke, her voice low and even. Eat. Then we plan. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the air feel steady again. Maya reached for the fork with slow hands, as though the act of eating in this kitchen, under this roof, was a risk she was measuring in her mind. She took a small bite, then another, and Josephine watched with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood how nourishment was about more than food. When Luca finally sat down across the table, still distracted by the noise of his morning inbox, Josephine's eyes met his with calm insistence. She had worked for him since he was a boy. She had known his parents before they passed, and she knew how to read his silences. She asked nothing of him directly, but her presence pressed him to listen in a way he often forgot. Maya began to speak between bites, not in the hurried way of someone trying to convince, but in the steady cadence of truth told too many times to be denied. She spoke of her brother, of nights on cold benches, of doors that opened and then closed again, of stars on a map that had gone dark. Her tone never begged for pity. It was only clear and measured, the same way she had spoken in the foyer last night. Josephine listened without interrupting, nodding slightly at certain points, her hands folded neatly on the table. She had heard countless stories in her years here. Excuses, inventions, polished lies dressed in polite words, but she knew the difference. She recognized the cadence of truth in a child's voice, the rhythm that comes from memory rather than performance. When Maya's story fell quiet, Josephine reached across the table and touched the folded paper map with her fingertips, not unfolding it, only resting her hand there as if to say she acknowledged its weight. Luca watched them both, realizing that Josephine had given Maya something he had not managed to give her yet, the assurance that her words were not only heard, but trusted. He saw how easily the girl leaned toward Josephine, not with dependence, but with the instinctive recognition that here was an adult who would not look away. For years, Josephine had been the steady current beneath the house, the one who kept order while others chased ambition. And now she was becoming something more. She was the bridge between his world of rules and Maya's world of survival, and she had taken that role without needing to be asked. When the plates were cleared, Josephine poured tea into small cups and said again, as calmly as before, "Eat. Then we plan." It was not a suggestion, but a promise, the kind that told both of them that this was not a passing moment of kindness. It was the beginning of something that would last. And in the stillness of the kitchen, with sunlight creeping across the tiles and steam rising from their cups, Luca realized that he was no longer facing this alone. The glass doors of 111 Harbor slid open with a soft hiss, the kind of sound meant to welcome executives and clients during the day. But tonight, they opened onto something different. The lobby glowed with steady light, the marble floor reflecting it in clean lines, the air holding a faint scent of polish and fresh coffee. The space was usually silent in the late hours, a hollow echo chamber of elevators and empty chairs, but now it carried the muted rhythm of quiet preparation. A guard named Reuben, tall and broad-shouldered with a patient expression, unrolled canvas cots against the far wall, his movements steady, the sound of the fabric soft against the stone. A nurse on contract, her badge swinging from her pocket, moved from person to person with a calm efficiency, checking pulses, listening to breathing, offering small words of comfort without making them heavy. A janitor carried kettles to the side counter, plugging them in and filling them with water, the sharp click of the switches breaking the silence before steam began to rise. Maya walked through the lobby holding her younger brother's hand. Leo was smaller than his age suggested, his hoodie hanging loose, his head drooping with exhaustion. When Reuben pointed toward a cot, Maya helped him climb onto it, smoothing the blanket over his shoulders, whispering something that made his small body finally loosen. Within minutes, his breathing grew deep and steady, and for the first time in many nights, he did not stir. The sight pulled something taut inside Luca's chest as he stood by the elevator bank, watching the boy surrender to sleep, as though the building itself had promised to guard him. The others who entered the lobby moved carefully, their voices low, as if they sensed that this was not charity handed down, but space being shared. Some sat in chairs with their heads resting against the wall. Others accepted the cots Reuben rolled out. One older man simply sat cross-legged on the floor and let the warmth of the room wash over him. The silence was not the hollow emptiness of unused space. It was the kind of silence that comes when people are allowed to rest without fear. Every sound was softened. Even the hum of the vending machines seemed quieter, as though the building itself was adjusting to its new purpose. Maya did not sleep at first. She sat beside Leo, her backpack tucked against her side, her eyes roaming the room with the same practiced alertness that had guided her through the city streets. But when Josephine arrived with blankets folded neatly in her arms, setting them down like gifts rather than supplies, Maya finally leaned back in her chair. She looked at Luca for a long moment, her gaze unreadable, and then she let out a slow breath, her hand still resting lightly on her brother's shoulder. Luca remained standing, feeling the weight of his choice and the strange lightness it brought with it. The lobby had cost nothing to open, only a decision, yet the change was greater than any figure on a balance sheet. As the hours stretched on, and the building settled into its quiet rhythm, he realized he was seeing his own creation in a new way. It was no longer just a tower of steel and glass. It was a place where silence meant safety and warmth meant dignity. For the first time, the emptiness of the lobby felt like respect. By dawn, the lobby at 111 Harbor had become something no one had planned for. What had started with a handful of people grew through the night until nearly 50 were spread across chairs and cots, some dozing, some whispering, some simply sitting still and letting warmth soak into their bones. The hush of the space held steady, broken only by the soft cough of someone sleeping, or the low hum of the kettles keeping water hot. It was quiet but not empty, full but not chaotic. And when the first light of morning touched the glass, the rumor had already begun to move beyond the building. By breakfast time, word had spread farther than the block, carried in voices that traveled faster than any press release. There was a lobby open, no questions asked, a place with light and quiet where people could sleep without being pushed away. At 9:12 a.m. sharp, the rumor drew its first official consequence. A city inspector arrived, stepping through the same glass doors that had opened so freely the night before. He carried a clipboard tucked under his arm and wore a smile that seemed meant to reassure but did not touch his eyes. His gaze moved quickly across the lobby, over the folded blankets and the half-awake figures gathering their things, over the cots stacked neatly against the wall, and the vending machines still humming. He asked to see the person in charge, his tone light but pointed, and when Luca appeared from his office upstairs, the inspector's smile grew thinner. Permits were questioned immediately, words like occupancy and liability sliding off the inspector's tongue with practiced rhythm. He spoke of fines, of violations, of the danger of allowing people to remain overnight in a space designed for business and not for shelter. He said the city could not condone such activity without paperwork, without review, without assurance. He tapped his clipboard as though the sound of pen against metal could erase what had happened in the night. He warned that the doors could be forced closed again if things were not corrected. Luca felt the familiar weight of pressure, the same weight he often carried into boardrooms when deals were at risk. But here the pressure felt different. It was not investors or shareholders. It was the presence of 50 tired people who had finally found a corner of safety. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, Josephine stepped forward. Her hands were steady, her glasses low on her nose, a thick binder tucked under her arm that had been pulled from the shelves of the Sterling archives. She spoke without raising her voice, reading directly from the city's own codebook, citing sections and subsections with clarity that made the inspector blink. She pointed out clauses that allowed lobbies to remain open to the public, language that permitted temporary occupation under the category of emergency relief. Footnotes about liability exceptions under charitable extension. The inspector tried to interrupt, but Josephine did not falter, turning each page with the calm of someone who had studied longer than he expected. By the time she finished, the clipboard hung loose in his hands, and the smile had vanished altogether. He muttered something about needing to review, about checking with his superiors, but no fines were written, no closure order delivered. He left through the same glass doors he had entered, his steps brisk but unsteady, and the building returned to its silence once more. Luca looked at Josephine with a mix of relief and gratitude, realizing she had not only defended the building but had bought them time. The cost of light was not just the electricity that ran through the lobby or the staff that kept the kettles full. It was the attention it drew, the resistance it provoked, the pushback that would keep coming. Yet as he glanced at Maya, who sat with her brother eating a piece of toast Josephine had brought down, he knew it was a cost worth paying. The first hint came in an email from compliance, written in the cautious tone of people who know their findings may upset the wrong person. They had been asked to search for loopholes that would keep the lobby program open, but instead they stumbled across something else, something that did not fit inside the usual rhythm of bills and approvals. The invoices came from a facilities vendor Luca barely recognized, a company that claimed to provide emergency cleaning, security backfill, and what they labeled community liaison services. The words sounded harmless, even helpful, but the numbers were strange. Charges doubled at night, even when no one reported incidents, and the same names repeated across multiple sheets, as if the same small team was billing 5 times for the same work. Luca sat with the files spread across his desk, the glow of his computer screen reflecting off the glass walls of his office. He called Conrad Pike in, the CFO who had always been quick with explanations, and asked where the vendor had come from. Conrad shrugged, his tie loose around his neck, his expression practiced. He said it was normal to hire flexible contractors, normal for costs to rise at night, normal for names to repeat when specialized staff were in demand. He tapped one invoice with his pen and said the city expected rapid response teams, and this company was simply filling the gap. His words were smooth, but they slipped past Luca without sticking, because behind them was a hollow space where accountability should have been. Maya was in the room too, sitting cross-legged in a chair by the window, her map folded on her lap. She had asked to see what they were looking at, her sharp eyes moving over the lines of numbers with the same patience she used on her grid of streets. She studied the addresses listed on the vendor forms, most of them scattered across the waterfront, and her brow furrowed when she reached one in particular. She leaned forward, pressing her finger on the page, and said quietly, "That office never has lights on." Luca looked at her, then at the address. He had passed it dozens of times in his car, a low suite sandwiched between a storage unit and a print shop. He had never thought to look at it at night, never thought to wonder who was inside. Maya said she had walked by it often, sometimes late, sometimes very late, and it was always dark. She said real offices had cleaning crews, deliveries, people moving in and out, but this one was a shadow, the kind of place where nothing happened except on paper. Her voice was calm, certain, the cadence of observation rather than suspicion. Conrad gave a laugh that was too quick, dismissing her comment as childish guessing, but the sound cracked in the air. Luca did not laugh. He stared at the address again, at the repeating names and doubled amounts, at the words community liaison services that meant nothing and explained less. He realized Maya had spotted in a moment what his staff had overlooked for months, that the numbers were only part of a disguise, and behind them, something else was moving. The office with no lights might hold the answers the invoices refused to show. Luca and Josephine chose plain coats instead of the tailored clothes that usually set them apart, coats that made them look like any other pair of people moving through the waterfront. The building listed on the vendor invoices stood between a storage unit and a shuttered print shop, its windows clouded with dust that blurred the view inside. The door opened with a jingle that sounded too new for a place that claimed to be busy every night. Inside, the suite smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, but beneath it hung the heavier scent of stillness, the way air settles in a room that no one uses. A receptionist's desk sat near the door, but it was empty, the surface clear except for a single potted plant that looked too perfect, its soil untouched, its leaves without dust. Behind the desk stood a printer with a light blinking green, but when Josephine brushed her finger across the top, it came away gray, thick with dust that had been settling for weeks. The calendar on the wall showed a month already past, its days unmarked, as if no one had needed to keep track of time here. A stack of files lay open on a side table, invoices neatly clipped, all bearing the same names they had seen on the spreadsheets, the same signatures, the same careful handwriting that did not vary line to line. Josephine walked slowly around the room, her eyes sharp behind her glasses, taking in every small detail: the lack of paper in the bins, the spotless counters, the way the office phone's cord had a kink in it that suggested it had not been lifted in weeks. Luca stood still in the middle of the room, his hands in his pockets, staring at the evidence of staging. This was not an office where people worked. It was a stage set, built to look busy to anyone who only looked quickly, but failing under the gaze of anyone who chose to linger. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Ruben, the guard at 111 Harbor, sent with the calm urgency of someone who had learned not to panic. The photo showed a man in a vendor's jacket crouched by the entrance, one hand reaching for the small laminated sign Josephine had insisted they put up, the one that said, "Quiet Hours" in neat block letters. The man's other hand held a screwdriver, poised to unscrew the bolts. Ruben's caption was short: "Caught him trying to take it down. Says he's with the contractor." Josephine came to Luca's side and looked at the photo, her mouth pressed into a line, not of surprise but of confirmation, as if the staged office had already told her this truth. She whispered that they were paying people not to clean, not to guard, not to help, but to erase. Erase signs, erase space, erase dignity. Luca felt something harden in his chest, the kind of shift that came before decisions that could not be undone. He looked once more at the office around him, the lifeless plant, the wrong month on the wall, the dust on the machine that supposedly ran each night, and then back at Josephine. He realized this was not about small mistakes or careless billing. It was deliberate, precise, a system built to profit from absence, to charge for services never given, and to dismantle what little safety had been created. The walkthrough had changed everything. It was no longer a question of finding a way to keep a lobby open. It was a question of exposing those who wanted it closed. The pattern showed itself slowly, like a knot tightening as they pulled on one stray thread. Josephine spread the invoices across Luca's desk, her glasses low on her nose, her pen marking the trails that led from one shell company to another. Each payment looked ordinary at first, amounts that matched what a large vendor might charge. But when strung together, they formed a chain that circled back on itself. Money left Sterling Urban Systems under the label of emergency cleaning, passed through a vendor account, then split into smaller transfers, each routed to a series of companies with names bland enough to go unnoticed. From there, the money resurfaced in the account of a foundation with a polished website and a glossy brochure. Luca leaned forward, recognizing the name. It was the same foundation Conrad Pike had mentioned, with enthusiasm at nearly every board meeting for the past year. An initiative he claimed would improve the company's relationship with the city, a partnership that supposedly helped keep streets clean and safe after dark. Conrad had spoken of it as a win-win, a way to meet civic expectations while protecting shareholder value. No one had argued with him, not when the numbers he presented always looked neat, not when the graphs rose in the right direction. Now the truth sat on the desk in front of them, the knot made visible. The more people pushed off private steps at night, the more the vendor claimed to remediate, the more invoices piled up with inflated charges. And with every cycle, Conrad's reports looked stronger. The board applauded, and the city kept paying into the program because the paperwork made the problem look managed. It was a system that profited from displacement, a machine that turned human exhaustion into tidy lines of revenue. Maya watched from her chair by the window, her map open again, her finger tracing the addresses that matched the invoices. She said the red X's always clustered near the vendors' sites, the places where people were driven away first, where the guards shouted loudest and the locks changed fastest. She said her brother coughed more on the nights when they were forced from those areas, because the safe alcoves disappeared and the wind bit harder. Her words were steady, but Luca heard the quiet anger beneath them, the clarity of someone who had felt the cost in her own body. Josephine flipped to another page and showed Luca how the foundation redirected part of its funds into a campaign account for a city official who had spoken publicly in praise of Conrad's initiative. The knot tightened again, pulling together money, influence, and reputation. It was not just about one vendor. It was about a structure built to look generous on paper while hiding the harm beneath. Luca sat back in his chair, the weight of realization pressing against him. He had built his company on numbers, on the clean logic of systems, but he had forgotten that numbers could be bent into lies when no one looked closely. Conrad had known exactly where to bend them, and he had tied the knot tight enough that no one noticed until Maya pointed at a dark office that never turned its lights on. The string had been pulled, and now there was no turning back. The idea was Maya's, offered in the same calm tone she used whenever she explained patrol routes or safe alcoves. She said if the vendor was being paid to clean problems that did not exist, then the only way to prove it was to show what happened when they thought no one was watching. "Leave the lobby open," she said. "Let people come as they always do, but move the cameras to face the sidewalk instead of the chairs. Record every interaction, every arrival, every hour." Josephine nodded at once. Reuben agreed with a firm shake of his head, and even Luca, who had learned to test everything with caution, felt a spark of certainty. The simplicity of it was the strength. That night, the lobby at 111 Harbor glowed as it had before, warm and steady. The quiet hum of kettles in the corner, cots lined neatly by the wall. A few families drifted in. A couple of men who usually slept on the subway sat down gratefully. An older woman leaned against a chair and sighed, as if the act of sitting was all she had needed. Reuben stayed at his post near the door, his presence calm but firm, making everyone feel the rules of the space without ever raising his voice. The city ombudsman arrived just after midnight, plain clothes, but carrying the weight of authority, their notebooks ready, their expressions wary but open. Luca walked the perimeter of the lobby twice before he settled by the door with Maya beside him. Her map rested on her lap, her pencil ready to mark what she saw. The hours stretched with quiet normalcy, the kind of silence that confirmed the space was being used as it should. Nothing broken, nothing damaged, nothing disturbed. Then, at 1:03 a.m., on the dot, the moment arrived. Through the glass doors came three men in vendor jackets, their tool bags slung over their shoulders, their eyes scanning the lobby as if expecting chaos. They paused when they saw the calm scene, then exchanged quick glances before stepping back outside. Luca signaled to Reuben, who moved one of the cameras to catch their movements on the sidewalk. The feed showed the men opening their bags and pulling out fast food wrappers, crumpled cups, even an empty bottle. They scattered the trash across the steps with practiced ease, snapping photos with their phones as they went. Josephine pressed record on her own device. The ombudsman leaned forward, their pens scratching furiously, and Luca lifted his phone high enough for the live stream to catch everything in sharp detail. The crew had no idea they were being filmed from 3 angles. They took turns setting a torn blanket near the vent, arranging it carefully to look abandoned. Then one man tipped over a trash bin with exaggerated noise. They stepped back as though surveying a disaster, nodding to each other in satisfaction. Then the glass doors opened, and they found themselves face to face with the people they had not expected. Luca stood in the center, his coat unbuttoned, his expression calm but sharp. Reuben flanked him on one side, broad and steady, the ombudsman on the other, notebooks raised. Maya held up the phone with the live stream, her small hand steady, her voice clear as she said, "We are recording." The men froze, caught between denial and flight, but there was nowhere to go. The lobby lights made everything too clear, the cameras too honest, the evidence too undeniable. For the first time since the program began, the truth was not just whispered in reports or hidden in ledgers. It was visible in real time, undeniable and plain. Luca looked at the crew and said quietly, "This is over." And in that moment, he knew it was, because the night of proof had been written not in contracts or numbers, but in light, in eyes that would not look away, and in a child's simple plan carried out with precision. The next morning, the air in the boardroom felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of what had been uncovered in the night. Luca sat at the head of the long table, the ledger open in front of him, its pages filled with neat rows of numbers that no longer looked harmless. Across from him, Conrad Pike shifted in his chair, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his tie loosened, his expression arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who thought he could still steer the storm away. The other directors sat stiff and watchful, their hands folded, their eyes moving from one man to the other, waiting to see who would speak first. Conrad began quickly, words spilling into the silence, blaming process before anything else. He said the vendor had been vetted, that the systems were designed to handle emergencies, that any irregularities were the fault of clerks or contractors who had cut corners without his knowledge. When that explanation landed with dull weight, he shifted to blaming the city, saying their inspectors encouraged the partnerships, that the city demanded results and rewarded the speed of companies who could show visible progress. He said the fines threatened against Sterling Urban Systems had forced them to act, that it was all about survival in a hostile market. When he saw the doubt on their faces, he turned his gaze toward the far end of the room, where Maya sat quietly beside Josephine, the map folded on her lap, her small figure dwarfed by the high-backed chair. Conrad's tone sharpened, his voice pointing like a finger without needing to raise one. He said the noise around the lobbies had been stirred by a child's exaggerations, by emotional stories twisted into evidence, by someone who did not understand the scale of corporate responsibility. His words dripped with condescension, and the silence that followed was sharper than any argument. Luca let it hang, then placed a hand on the ledger and began to read aloud. His voice was steady, unhurried, each date and sum clear, each signature pronounced as if to strip the ink of its disguise. He read page after page, numbers that had been doubled, names that repeated, payments routed through companies that did not even have offices with working lights. The room stayed still, except for the scratch of Josephine's pen, as she noted each detail, her head bent in calm precision. Conrad's face flushed, then paled, his shoulders stiffening as if the air had grown too thin. When Luca finished, he closed the ledger with finality and said the words that ended the argument. He suspended Conrad on the spot, his voice calm but without space for negotiation. He ordered the contracts with the vendor frozen, every payment stopped, every file seized. Then he gestured toward the adjoining conference room, where a new sign had been fixed to the wall just that morning, its letters plain but powerful, "Community Desk." He said investigators from the city and federal offices had already been invited to work there, that every document would be reviewed in the open, that nothing would be hidden. The directors exchanged glances, some surprised, some relieved, but none spoke against him. Conrad sat rigid, his mouth pressed shut, his career unraveling in front of him. Luca looked at Maya then, the girl who had begun this by pointing at a building with no lights, and saw her eyes steady and unflinching. For the first time he felt the ground shift beneath the company he had built, not in collapse, but in correction. A reckoning that had been long overdue. The front door looked different in the morning light, less like a barrier and more like a marker of how far things had shifted since that first night. Maya stood on the same step where she had once knocked with a small fist, her backpack still slung across her shoulders, but her face held none of the hesitation it had then. She did not come with fear this time. She came with paper folded neatly in her hand, pencil marks pressed deep into the surface from where she had written and rewritten her thoughts until they felt solid. When Luca opened the door, she did not wait to be asked in. She stepped forward and handed him the folded sheet as if it were something official. Across the top, written in her careful block letters, were the words, "After Hours Havens." Beneath them, she had drawn lines and boxes, her version of a blueprint, showing how a program could work if it were not just one building, but many. She explained without pause, her voice steady, her eyes fixed on him. A rotation of empty lobbies across the city, each open from 11 at night until 5 in the morning. Quiet lights kept on, hot water available, 2 guards trained not in force, but in de-escalation, a nurse on duty at least 3 nights a week, and a shuttle at dawn to take people safely to transit or shelters that opened in the daytime. It was all laid out in pencil, simple but practical, as though she had been building this in her head for years. Luca read as she spoke, the words and lines carrying more weight than any corporate proposal he had seen in months. She said the nights were the hardest, when people were most at risk, when the cold pressed in and tempers grew sharp, when moving from step to step became a punishment rather than a choice. She said these havens would not be permanent homes, but they would be enough to give people safety until morning, enough to keep them from being pushed into danger. She pointed to the stars on her map, the green ones that had gone dark, and said those were the places that had once been safe, and with his help they could be made safe again. For a moment Luca was silent, the paper open in his hands, the pencil marks smudged at the edges from her fingers. He thought about the investors who would argue, the board members who would complain, the inspectors who would return with clipboards and threats. He thought about the cost, not just in money but in patience, in reputation, in the endless work of defending the decision. But then he thought about the first knock on the door, the boy asleep in the lobby, the faces that had filled the space with silence that felt like dignity. He realized what she was asking was not charity, not even kindness, but permanence, a promise that the door would not close again when the night grew cold. He looked at her and nodded once, the decision made with more certainty than any deal he had ever signed. He said they would not only keep 111 Harbor open, they would build the rotation she had drawn. They would make the stars bright again. Maya's shoulders eased, not in relief but in recognition, as though she had known all along this was possible, as though she had only needed someone to listen. The city on paper came first, neat and polished, the kind of city that fits into files and spreadsheets. Lawyers drafted pages of indemnities, their language tight and deliberate, spelling out who carried which risks, and what could never be blamed on Luca's company. Insurers, after their first wave of protest, rewrote riders to cover the new program. Their fees adjusted upward, but their signatures pressed in ink all the same. The safety division of Sterling Urban Systems prepared a new internal rule, one line that mattered more than the length of the contracts. Any after-hours incident that went unanswered would not just be logged by a manager, it would ping Luca's phone directly. He did not argue the intrusion, he insisted on it. If the program was going to work, he wanted to feel the weight of it himself. Symbols appeared next. Each building that agreed to participate posted a small blue star in the corner of its lobby window, no bigger than the palm of a hand, but bright enough to be noticed from the street. Maya had chosen the color, a shade close to the one she had drawn on her map to mark safe doors, and the star carried the quiet promise that here was a place of light and silence where the night could be endured. The first week was uneven, the way beginnings always are. Guards were uncertain of their roles, some too strict, some too lenient, unsure how to balance firmness with care. A nurse missed a shift when schedules were confused, and two lobbies nearly closed early when inspectors returned to check permits. Complaints came in from tenants who did not like the sight of strangers resting in their foyers, calls from board members who feared the optics, messages from columnists who questioned whether the company had overstepped. But while the papers debated and the managers fretted, the practice of the city wrote itself in smaller, quieter lines. A boy slept without coughing through the night, because the air inside was warm and still. A woman found a chair to rest in instead of a stairwell, and in the morning she left a note of thanks folded on the counter. Reuben texted Josephine to say, the lobby at 111 Harbor had stayed calm. 50 people in and 50 people out. No trouble, just sleep. Each day the reports became shorter, less dramatic, until they resembled the ordinary rhythm of maintenance logs. The extraordinary slowly became routine. Luca read every report in the evenings, his phone buzzing less often as the system steadied. He noticed how quickly the mess of the first days gave way to patterns, how the fear of chaos dissolved into habit. He thought about the difference between the city on paper, all sharp edges and clauses, and the city in practice, made of bodies resting in chairs and cots, of silence that meant safety, of stars in windows that offered more truth than any ledger. Maya watched too, marking her map with new circles and new stars, and each time she pressed the pencil down, she did it with the calm certainty of someone who had seen hope tested and found it held. Months passed, and what began as an experiment smoothed into rhythm, the kind of rhythm that no longer needed headlines or daily debate. The lobbies with the blue stars had become part of the city's night, places people walked toward without fear, doors that did not close when darkness stretched long. Lawyers stopped writing frantic notes, insurers stopped wringing their hands, and the board, after all its complaints, began to boast about the public praise. But for Luca, the real measure was not in reports or figures. It was in the sight of people sleeping through the night and leaving in the morning with steadier steps. The program carried a name now, After Hours Havens, and under its simple logo, printed on the signs that glowed in the corners of every participating lobby, were three initials pressed in small letters, M.R. Maya Reyes. The decision had been hers, offered in a shy nod when Josephine suggested recognition, and agreed by Luca without hesitation. It was her map, her vision, her persistence that had turned empty square footage into safety, and no one else had the right to claim it. The ceremony was small, quiet, held in the lobby of 111 Harbor, where it all began. There were no speeches from officials, only a short line of words engraved on a plaque fixed to the wall near the entrance. This light stays on. Staff stood at the edges. Some tenants came down out of curiosity, and a few of the people who had used the lobby in the early nights returned to witness the moment. The air held the steady glow of lamps, the clean scent of polished stone, and a hush that felt more like reverence than formality. Maya stood beside Luca, her hands folded around the strap of her backpack as always, her eyes moving not to the cameras that had arrived, but to the plaque itself, reading the words slowly as though testing them. Leo clung to her side, smaller than her still, though stronger now, his color better, his steps firmer after months of regular sleep. Luca lowered himself to one knee, bringing his eyes level with the boys, and thanked him. He said the night Leo slept in this lobby was the night that changed everything. The night that taught a company to wake up. The boy's eyes widened at being addressed so seriously, and then he smiled. A quiet, shy curve of the mouth that lit the space more than the polished lamps ever could. After the small applause faded and the crowd thinned, Maya slipped a folded sheet of paper from her backpack. She laid it across the new desk set up beneath the plaque. The same map she had been marking for months, lines worn and colors faded, but still clear. She pointed to gaps, places where no stars shone, blocks that remained dark. There are still empty places, she said, her voice calm but insistent. Luca placed his hand on the map, pressing it flat beside hers. He looked at her and answered simply, "Good. We have work to do." The city outside hummed in its ordinary rhythm, but something about it had shifted. It was quieter, better, and true, because one door had stayed open and promised never to close again. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.